Welcome to Incubation Talk. Today we talk to Indie Wolverine, like every month from now on. Welcome to our talk.
Hey, how's it going? I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, so today we'll talk about marketing.
Yep. Whole bunch of marketing talk, and we'll continue to do this in the future. But I think today, you can go ahead and intro it, but I think it's going to be maybe some target market stuff.
What is that actually about, target market research?
If I had to define target market to start there, I think it's a more broad view. If you had to visualize target market research, the way that I visualize it is kind of like a funnel of research. The target market, it can be just core demographics. For example, and this is speaking outside of the video game industry, if I were to start like a beard manicuring company, something with like beard oils, and then you automatically know that your target market is not, women, teenage girls. You automatically have an assumption of what your target market is.
So it always starts with an assumption there.
Yeah, so you always start with an assumption, and then you narrow that assumption down, and then you find facts and statistics to back up your assumptions within target market research. But just the target market, I like to look at it as the most broad view of what you believe your audience is, whether it be, men ages 20 to 50, which that's very, very broad, but it's a starting point. And then from there on, you get into segmentation, and then you start to narrow down your focus into who you believe the segments of your audience actually are.
Why do I need to know this? Why do I need to know who my target audience is?
Understanding who your target market is, it's something that works in many different ways. You can have a lot of different goals. If you're doing this really early on, possibly before you're even concepting a game, you can use target market research to identify what type of game you'd like to create. Maybe you want to create a game within a certain market that's seemingly booming, and you believe there's an opportunity there. Or if you're further along within the development process of your game, you can use target market research to identify certain features that you want to position prominently within your marketing material. So your trailer, your screenshots, even your store, like your Steam store page and other distribution platforms, wherever you're selling your product, your game, target market research can help you optimize how you display your game assets and essentially how you communicate your game. But again, there's many different reasons why you would conduct target market research.
So let's talk about doing target market research for video games, but basically that's what this whole talk is about. Where do you start?
It really depends on what you're looking to do with the research that you're conducting. There's quick and dirty ways to do it.
Okay, let's start with the quick and dirty one. Like, how do I get a broad view quickly about my target market?
We always start with assumptions, and then we narrow things down using statistics, reports, interviews, things of that sort to figure out who our audience is. For example, the dirtiest way to do this is the way that we did it with a game called Polygod. And if I'll pull it up on my screen here, I actually have a case study for Polygod. We worked with, it's a solo developer from South Africa. It's a roguelike, a procedurally generated roguelike. They approached us, would have to say, just a few weeks prior to launch. When they approached us, there was no website, there was no press kit, there was no press list, there was no announcements of the game in the past. They didn't use any PR beats to announce the game or announce any new features or show it off. So essentially nobody knew it existed outside of South Africa.
So you had a game not really well known and not really well marketed. So how do you start assuming their target audience?
Again, going back to how dirty this is. So within the first conversation that we had with Dominic, we try to identify what inspirations the developer has with this game. What did you take from other games? Because, no game is completely unique with everything down to the art style is just completely never been seen before.
So first you start to position the game, like where it comes from, to what other games do they relate, and what kind of genre convention would it fit?
Exactly. So we're trying to figure out, like, where are the similarities with current games, with games that are popular today? This can be a similarity in art style. This can be in core mechanics, in a genre. There are just many different ways that a game can pull inspirations from other games. And with Polygod, Dominic frequently brought up that The Binding of Isaac and Risk of Rain as being a couple of games that were big inspirations. Those were his favorite games to play in general. He likes games that have a high difficulty curve, that have procedurally generated elements so you can keep playing them over and over and over. In The Binding of Isaac, that's essentially how it is. After our initial conversation, I was given a demo, and I played the game. Very difficult game. I couldn't get past the first level. I started to understand that this game is only going to appeal to a certain type of gamer. What we want is not only for players to pick this game up, buy it, but we also want them to enjoy it. Especially now with Steam, if they buy it, it doesn't necessarily that's guaranteed revenue. They can refund that game within 2 hours. We want to be in front of players that really enjoy the game, they come back to it, and they engage in the community, and they're just the ideal player, essentially. So the dirty way that we did it is through the conversations that I had with Dominic, plus the gameplay that I had with an early build of the game. I assumed that this game would be perfect for players that not only play The Binding of Isaac, but really love the higher difficulty, achievements in The Binding of Isaac. The people that really love The Binding of Isaac.
So depicting the target market for your new game would be looking at The Binding of Isaac and then looking who the hardcore gamers actually are.
Looking at a very broad scope of what the target market was for Polygod, we essentially pinned it down to hardcore roguelike players that enjoy games like Binding of Isaac and Risk of Rain. With those similarities, we started thinking, all right, well, this is going to be the player base that we want to attract to this game. These are going to be the players that play Polygod, because it was launching on Steam as an early access title, and that's another thing to keep in mind. If you're launching your game, with an earlier build, whether it be an alpha or beta version of it, you 100% want to attract a very specific audience, because with Steam, if you get flooded with negative reviews, that it can leave you dead on arrival, or at least leave you with a very uphill battle in terms of getting those reviews kind of pushed down with a bunch of positive reviews. And the best way to do this is to just have a very narrow, specific core audience that you want to attract, and those are going to be the players that will play your game, love your game, and hopefully leave a positive review, and they'll be the ones that will help other players in the community forums for you. So that's essentially what happened with Polygod.
But let's get back to the assumption. So you take the assumption of your market, of your targeted market. You decide it's going to be hardcore, rough-like gamers that really like games like The Binding of Isaac. You have this assumption. How do you validate this assumption?
Let's say we're making Polygod, it doesn't exist. What we would do is there's what we like to call netnography, and essentially this is studying your audience kind of lurking in the background. You want to look at the community forums for The Binding of Isaac. So this is where competitive research comes into play. You want to see, what do they like about The Binding of Isaac? What are people talking about?
So where do you find the players of The Binding of Isaac?
So what you could do is, and let me see if I can do this on the fly here on my screen. I like to use advanced search queries. So I would use The Binding of Isaac plus, and then we could do community. And this will search for the exact term, The Binding of Isaac, and then plus the word community. As we can see right here, we're pulling up the Steam community pages for the various Binding of Isaac games. There's also this anti-birth. Not going to click on that real quick. I want to read the meta description. An unofficial fan-made expansion. Okay. So you can see it's pulling up, and it even pulls up the Reddit here, the subreddit for The Binding of Isaac. So these are ways to find communities for games that you're trying to research. And what you would do is you would go through, check the discussions, and then just look through them and as a lurker and see, what are some things that they're not happy with? What are they happy with? Like simple online co-op.
So what did you find when you were lurking in the community of The Binding of Isaac?
We want to reach the hardcore players of The Binding of Isaac, right? The best way to segment that player base and find the most hardcore of the most hardcore Binding of Isaac players is to go to the Steam page, and I'm pulling it up here. And then you want to go down to the achievements. So now you can see what we do. We're segmenting the audience, essentially. We assumed that because of this game is inspired by The Binding of Isaac and Risk of Rain. At the time, The Binding of Isaac, and I would say so today, The Binding of Isaac is still a more popular game. There's a larger audience, more active audience. And we wanted to attract the most hardcore of the hardcore. These are players that don't shy away from difficulty. So there are some achievements here that out of all of the owners of The Binding of Isaac, very small percentage of the players have met these achievements. So these are some of the achievements that, people that absolutely love the game and embrace difficulty are going to achieve. So this is how we segmented that audience. We did it in a very quick and dirty way, but it worked for our purpose. So the campaign that we came up with was people that met these certain achievements. So that's our segmented audience would get a copy of Polygod for free when it launched on Steam as an early access title for, I think it was 7 days. There was a 7-day period.
But can you just hit the achievements and see who got them?
Exactly, yeah. So what we did is we had all the players that had met these achievements. They had to message the developer, and we linked his Steam account in the press release and all the messages to media. They would have to, it was a very manual process, which the developer did not like because he was flooded with a bunch of requests. But it was only 7 days, and then afterwards the campaign's over.
So you segmented your group, and then how did you approach them? How do you find the space and the place where you could post all these marketing messages and reach out to these customers?
We did competitive research. When you're doing competitive research, ideally you go back about 3 months. You want to get the most up-to-date stuff as possible. Reporters, journalists, they change publications and job titles all the time. So if you have a master press list, in a couple weeks, it can be, a good majority of it can be completely not up to date. So we went through and we researched publications, content creators, so YouTube, Twitch, that covered The Binding of Isaac, whether it be through gameplay videos, let's plays, or with publications if they're covering expansions or announcements, whatever it may be. So that's where we went back to Google, and then you would do this. So going back to advanced search queries, we go The Binding of Isaac, we go to news, then we go to tools, and then we go to sort by date, and then we go custom range, and then we can choose how far back we go. So we go 1, 2, 3, and then to the 31st. And here we go. So there's not a lot, as you can see. You're having like this. People are covering the spinoff because there's not a lot of new Binding of Isaac news. I mean, you do have Afterbirth update, but you get what I'm saying here is that we're looking for specifically websites that are covering the Binding of Isaac.
So basically, you did the same as you did with your customers when it comes to PR, right? So you figure out who are your players by looking at their core demographics and see if they are like the most vivid players, and then you figure out like who's talking about the game, and then you approach them too. Is that true?
Yeah. So essentially, what we're doing is we're identifying an audience, and then we need to figure out who speaks to this audience, who's the amplifiers, who's going to take our message and amplify it to our targeted audience.
Right, because you can't really speak to your customers directly.
Yeah. So we can't just send out a bunch of messages. So we need to go to, like, for example, Polygon. You just go through and you find all of the publications that have covered the game that you're doing a competitive analysis of. And if that game has similarities and you believe your game could resonate with, that game's audience, then you need to find out who's covering that game and then reach out to them.
So how did this pay off?
The results were pretty good. So I'll scroll down here in the case studies. We had over 1,800 Steam keys redeemed during the promotion, which was about, I believe it was exactly 7 days. We earned coverage from Eurogamer, Destructoid, GameSpot, many others, but those were kind of the big three. Something cool that happened that we didn't expect. Followers of prominent content creators and influencers would reach out to them on Twitter and say, hey, have you heard of this Polygod game? They're running a promotion, that involves the Binding of Isaac. When we are earning headlines, we start to get name association with Polygod, Binding of Isaac. You start to get that name association. Ideally, you get followers to share your game, with your targeted influencer, but it's very hard to get them to do that. It has to be a very indirect thing. It has to be kind of organic, and that's how this turned out.
It doesn't sound like this is the approach you would take all the time, right, when you're doing market research?
The process is very similar, or the idea behind it is very similar. The process was a bit different because we didn't have a lot of time. I don't have it in this browser, but there is an extension that we use. It's for Chrome, and essentially what you would do is hold down Control and left click, drag all the way down, and it copies all the links and page titles for everything. That's why you'll see under my search results, it goes pretty long. I've actually set it to be that way under settings to copy the page title and the URL of all of these results. You're able to paste it into a spreadsheet, and then you can remove all of the duplicates in that spreadsheet, and then you have a perfect list right there of all the media publications that you'd like to target. And then all you do at that point is click through them one by one, identify who the writer is, find their email address or their Twitter, and then reach out to them.
So this is a good example of how things got right? So you showed us how you got a quick and dirty assumption about your targeted audience, then you defined a segment of them, and then you reach out through them through competitive analysis and see who was talking about the game, and then gave away some free keys to people who are really, really into the game that is your biggest competitor. Do you have a situation where you did a targeted audience and you did all these steps wrong?
Yes, I do. I have a very bad one. Ideally, you create 4 customer profiles. We call them player personas. If you create any more, you start to get a bit out of hand. It gets a bit diluted with the information that you're putting together. But the segments, what you do is you identify that broad target market. The segment always starts with demographics. So you want to fill out gender, age. And then from there, you layer on top of the demographics with behavioral information and psychographics. A lot of personas in the marketing world, they have, job title, average yearly salary, family status. Are they single? Are they, in a family? Are they married? Facebook, I don't know if it is today. I haven't checked today. But I mean, it would even show you if someone's interested in buying a new car. So there are a lot of things that you can pull from. But when you're working on player personas, a lot of that's not really valuable. So you want to focus on things that are valuable to you. And I'll show you an example. So here's the finalized product of personas that we created. We created 3 for this game. We put these together through research of various data sources that were available to us.
So what kind of data sources are those?
Data sources can come from your own social media audience reports, like Facebook audience insights, Twitter audience insights, your own Google Analytics for your website. What you do is you check these sources, and you can even, on like Facebook, for example, if your game is similar to a game that has a large following, you can even check their game out through interests. If you put in like Diablo, you'll find like it'll pull audience demographics for a large game like that.
Right. So that the research that you do in these kinds of databases are primarily done to get the demographics right, but not to get the description right, I imagine.
Yeah. So what you always want to start with the demographics, and then create segments off of those layer on top of the segments. So again, we use information gathered from sources that we have available to us. The first things that we have are social media data of ourselves and of our competitors, if the competitor is large enough. On top of that, you have industry reports that you can Google. There are free ones. Newzoo has some. There's a couple of reports that just went free. Eco Partners, they're also an excellent resource for crowdfunding as well. But really, you can find all of this through again, Google searches. So if I were to search free and then plus VR industry, and then we could do plus report. You've got these. You have VR AR marketing report. So, but you know what? Let me pull up that one from Eco Partners. All we have to do is VR plus report and then plus Eco Partners. And this should virtual reality, VR and games media. Let's see. Let's see if this gives us what we want. Yep, there we go. VR and games media. There's a report. We can download that report in real time. It is free. And then you just put in your email address and then you get the report. There's just all of this information that you can gather through just advanced search queries in Google. Going back to our personas, what we used is a combination of audience data through social metrics, through our Google Analytics, through industry reports, but more importantly, and this is the most important part, personal interviews. We would do interviews of our audience, one-to-one interviews via Skype, record those interviews, and then ask them open-ended questions. Ask them, whatever your goal is. If you're trying to, if you just, ran a closed alpha, you can do a survey, or you can, you can conduct player interviews, ask them about, the game. How was it? Did they find any bugs, any glitches? Were there any features they didn't like? Any things that they did like? And then you get your answers there. What we've done in the past with player interviews is, we'll go into the Steam forums or our own subreddit or wherever our community hub is. Now we're actually using Discord a lot more. And we'll ask people, if you have a moment, if you have, like 30 minutes, we would love to interview you. And then we would interview them via Skype. And some of the questions we'd ask are, where did you first find out about our game? Another question could be, what was the deciding factor in you making buying our game? And you ask them these open-ended questions to figure out where they found you, why did they purchase your game? Again, if you're in a closed alpha or beta state, you want to understand what are the features that they're liking. And these are things that you can position, your game, you can use as like the main value proposition for your game. But that's how we build out these descriptions is mainly through the personal interviews. For example, if we were to ask, where did you find out about our game? 8 or 9 of the 15 people that we ask say specifically PC gamer, and then they fit within a demographic of, men ages 25 to 34, then we're going to mark that up as, into the description here. We also ask things like, what other games are you currently playing? What are some of your favorite games? And you can fill this out that way. And personally, I believe that's the best way to fill it out. You don't have to do thousands of personal interviews. The rule of thumb is that when you're asking a question, if you can predict the answer, you're good. But you always want to make sure you have the demographic down for whoever you're interviewing. Make sure that's marked down, and then go through your questions. Make sure that you get everything recorded. And then again, when you're able to predict the answers and they start giving you those same answers that fit within the same core demographic, that's where you fill all this stuff out.
All right. So you made a couple of customer profiles for this big segment of this failed game, basically. So what did you do wrong there? Like, it sounds like you have a solid plan there. So what happened?
Yeah, so we drowned in the data, and this happens a lot. You can do too much. You can do too much research. We did way too much. We did way too many surveys. We reviewed way too many surveys. Before we even started working with this developer, they had already conducted years worth of surveys. And we used that data from years prior. 2-3 years back. And we were looking for consistencies within the all of the surveys and then all of our interviews. It's just so much data that we drowned in it. And by the time it came to launch the game, we didn't have anything ready. We didn't have anything that was specifically crafted towards the personas that we had created. So essentially we had made useless, personas because we didn't act on them. By the way, I'd like to click on this link, Quantic Foundry, something to note. Here's their gamer motivation model, and this is another quick way to identify, what type of gamer you can categorize someone as. But again, I wouldn't put too much stock into categorizing people, and I feel like what I'm showing you is the deep end. And this, for indies, I don't think you need to go off in the deep end. I think you can get by with competitive research to identify what similar games. So that's where your target market, the similar games that share a same player base that you want to attract. I think it's best to just conduct some ethnography, essentially lurking, see what players of those games, what are the features that they like, what do they dislike when those games launch massive updates, larger updates on Steam or wherever. What does the community say? What do they point out as things that they like? What do they not like? And then just learn from their mistakes. Also, when you're building out your audience and you're segmenting your audience, player interviews, again, that's the best way to go. I wouldn't really focus on rounds and rounds of surveys and hundreds of player interviews and just pulling data from everywhere, because you can drown in it. And you want it to be a process that kind of spikes your creativity, because that's what you're doing. The whole goal of this process is to identify, the player base that you want to attract, and then identify creative ways to get in front of that player base.
With Polyglot, you focused on one small, really specific audience, and you acted on it. You were inspired by their competitiveness and their hardcore value. And
that's what we're trying to,
yeah, and that's easy to act on because you have a clear design direction to work with. And
exactly.
When it came to the other game, you had so much data that you didn't know how to act on it because you could go either way, right?
Exactly.
But at the same time, you could also have been wrong about the Binding of Isaac.
I could have, but with the Binding of Isaac, that was an easier process. It was an easier process because when we played that game, you could just, again, it had the same itch. It had the same feeling to it. It scratched the same itches that the Binding of Isaac, does, where, just the core mechanics were there. Yes, it is an assumption, but assumptions, it's not a guarantee that your assumption is wrong. It's not a guarantee that your assumption is right. When you play a game and you have that gut decision and you don't have a lot of time, it's just, it feels easier. The validation was from the community feedback that we received, the people that played the game, and reviewed it in a positive light. If you look at Polygod when it first released, like one of the earlier trailers, you can see strictly from the gameplay, it's a very early version of that game. It's not something that jumps off your screen and you're like, I've got to buy it. So we were really doubling down on the core value of that game, and we identified the core value by playing it and understanding where their inspirations came from. What we should have done is identify the perfect players for that game and then start working on community building right away and build that community from day one. So when it came to launching on Steam and other distribution platforms, that we had a community already ready to go, that were already populated, like the games would be populated, and, new people that came across the game, they would join and there would be a nice populated world for them to explore. But that just wasn't necessarily the case. But there's always the should've, could've, would've's, within this. But with this one, we did create these personas based off of a lot of data and consistencies that we identified with the data. But again, we ended up drowning. We went a little bit too far.
All right, so let's wrap this up. We've talked about performing market research, target market research, the necessity of performing it, meaning you need to know your audience in order to talk to them. And you also need to know your audience in order to find the people who will talk to them for you. One way to do this is by assuming a particular audience, that's a broad audience, then narrow it down and see how you can reach them by see where they talk and where they hang, right?
Yep.
From that moment on, you started to reach out to their spokespeople or the people they listen to, their influencers,
exactly.
so to speak. And by choosing this really small segment, it was much more easier to pinpoint and to act on the data you collected.
Exactly.
So the main message here is narrow down your audience and focus.
Yes. So your game's only going to have this is where positioning comes in, but your game's only going to have a handful, or maybe one or two things that are what makes your game different and better. You're going to have similar things within whether it's a racing game, an RPG, an action game, you're going to fit within certain genres, but there's going to be something that's going to define your game. You need to find out what defines your game and double down on that. But you need to identify the audience that you believe will enjoy, whatever makes your game the most unique. We've been told many times in the past, yeah, I found your game via the Kind of Funny podcast. That's where we heard out about it. So then we knew, all right, every time we have a major news beat, we got to contact Greg Miller, and hopefully he picks us up. And, and that'll help us get in front of that audience even more.
Well, with that, I'd like to wrap up and close this first incubation talk within the Wolverine. Thank you, Logan, for being here and giving us such a great insight.
Thank you for having me.
In target market research. We'll be back next month. Stay tuned and see you next month. Bye.
Yeah. See ya.